Hey everyone, welcome to episode 1 of Scissors Beats Paper, a history podcast. I'm Nicole.
And I'm Logan.
And today we're going to talk about the Cold War. Now this is part 1 of 2-part series over the Cold War, which took place between 1947 and 1989. So we're going to talk about the tension between the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. during World War II, the policy of containment, the atomic age, and the Red Scare today. In 1947, President Harry S. Truman said, and I quote, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." End quote. This policy will later become known as the Truman Doctrine and will lead not only to a policy of containment, but also to proxy wars that will haunt the American people well into the 21st century. In general, I think that the Cold War came as a surprise to most Americans. Even though Americans who foresaw the trouble with the Russians, I'd argue that only a really small minority had expected anything worse than diplomatic bickering with Russia. The majority of people assumed that these issues would be worked out within the newly formed United Nations. But instead, the UN had turned out to be just one arena for the West-East conflict. So let's talk about the relationship between the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. during World War II.
In 1939, actually Germany and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that lasted from 1939 to 1941. They became allies, they exchanged goods and materials, and they secretly intended to split up Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe once Germany basically won World War I, or once they carried out their desire to take over Europe.
I think you mean World War II.
What did I say?
World War I.
Oh, damn it.
It's because we were talking about World War I earlier. This non-aggression pact that Russia had signed with Nazi Germany made it seem really unlikely that the USSR and the US would ever forge an alliance. This action, the non-aggression pact that they signed, caused President Franklin Roosevelt to publicly condemn the Soviet Union as, quote, "a dictatorship as absolute as any other dictatorship in the world," end quote, and order a moral embargo on the export of certain products to the USSR. So this non-aggression pact had, it really looked like, at the time, when World War II was raging, that America and Russia weren't going to be allies at all. But obviously, in light of the greater threat, Nazi Germany, the US and the USSR ultimately decided to play nice.
So in 1941, Germany decided to break that pact, invaded Russia. As soon as that happened, Russia switched allies to Britain, and then once Pearl Harbor was bombed, then with the US. This was much more of a alliance of necessity than a willing choice because of all of the history dating back to the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah, from the very beginning, the alliance between the USSR and the US was always a flawed one. There were frequently issues throughout the war that threatened the alliance all the time. One of those issues being the Soviets' refusal to aid the Polish Home Army during the Warsaw Uprising. There was also the decision of the British and the Americans to exclude the Soviets from secret negotiations with German officers. This was to secure the surrender of Germany and Italy. And also the most important disagreement was over the opening of a second front in the West, which Stalin especially wanted since his troops were struggling to hold the Eastern Front against Nazi forces.
Yeah, Stalin became increasingly paranoid of the relationship between the U.S. and Britain over the unwillingness to open that second front because of all of the destruction and death on the Eastern Front. Soviets estimated lost 20 million casualties during the war, whether through combat or siege or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, Russia really suffered, and if it's one thing that history's taught us about Russia, it's that they can take a punch. I mean, their population is massive, But regardless, the second front opening that Stalin wanted was initially promised to him by Roosevelt in 1942, and it kept getting pushed. It got pushed to 1943, and then it got pushed to 1944, and eventually Stalin really wondered if his allies were ever going to open that second front.
But then that did happen during the invasion of Normandy, D-Day. That's when that second front opened. That just left a couple years for Stalin and Russia to increase that mistrust, which obviously leads to further paranoia going into post-war time.
Right. I mean, the mistrust of everything getting post is kind of like my distrust of Square Enix. They keep telling me that Kingdom Hearts 3 is going to come out, and lo and behold, here I am 10 years later still waiting for it. Anyway, soon after the war, the alliance between the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. began to unravel. The war had been won by a coalition whose principal members were already at war, ideologically and geopolitically.
Yes, so the U.S., at this point, a democracy, capitalist society. Russia is a dictatorship, communist. The U.S. had a very different vision for what they wanted post-war in Europe. They wanted a free, open society, capitalism, all those things. Russia wanted Eastern Europe to basically be a buffer between Germany because of all the times that Germany has betrayed them or invaded them, going back to the 1800s.
Right, so in 1946, the Soviet Union dropped what we call the Iron Curtain, or a physical boundary that divided Eastern and East Central Europe from the West. The term itself, Iron Curtain, really symbolizes the efforts made by the Soviet Union to block itself and its satellite states from open contact with the West. Which brings us to the U.S.'s policy of containment, a strategy to prevent the spread of communism abroad.
So the author of this idea, this theory, is George Kennan. In 1946, he was stationed in Moscow at the U.S. Embassy. He was asked by the government to kind of explain why Russia acted the way they did, to basically give a reason why the U.S. should abandon cooperation with them. And his idea was that they should abandon cooperation and they should instead contain the spread of communism. And at this point, it was much more of a political theory, and it wasn't military. That only came in later during the proxy wars, which we will get to at another time.
Right, because the USSR and the U.S. never directly went to war. If it had, it most likely would have been a nuclear war, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the atomic age here in a little bit. But the idea or the theory of containment is often associated with the politics of President Harry Truman, who was also largely responsible for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, as we like to call it today.
More on Kennan, he basically observed that the Soviets were perpetually at war with other capitalist nations, so basically every other country in the world. And after the war, this didn't help after World War II because the U.S. immediately cut off all support militarily and economically to them. And he felt that they could not objectively see what within their society and externally, kind of the way that the world was shaped and was heading.
Yeah, one of the nice things for Stalin really is once World War II ends, Roosevelt ends up dying, and he is preceded by his vice president. And then at the same time, the British Prime Minister of World War II's end is actually defeated in the election shortly after World War II. So you have two men who lived through World War II but really don't have an idea of what they want post-war for either of their nations. Now, Stalin, who's been the leader of Russia now for, since 1929 or something like that, he has a vision and he knows what he wants. So he almost has the advantage going into the Cold War initially because the other two leaders of the other two powers that he's conflicting with don't really have an overall idea of what they want in this post-war world.
Yeah, Stalin definitely knew what he wanted. He knew that he wanted to be isolated further from Western Europe because of World War One when they were invaded as well, and then World War II. And speaking of all those casualties, he did not want that to happen ever again. He wanted to basically cripple German capability of ever becoming a world power again.
Or at least militarily a world power again. I guess economically too, because when you look at the fall of the Berlin Wall
Yeah.
and once all of that came down, I mean, East Germany was East Berlin was just a mess.
Yeah, you can't become a military power without having that robust economy that
Right,
Germany developed later in the 30s, heading into World War II.
right, that makes sense. Okay, so the idea of containment led us to several proxy wars, which we're not going to go into a lot of detail on proxy wars just because Korea and Vietnam for the United States could be a whole podcast just on its own. We don't have time, or unless you guys wanted to sit here for 3 additional hours to talk about Korea and Vietnam and how essentially this country almost failed in the 1960s between Vietnam and the civil rights movement and all of those things going on, the Kennedy assassination. It all is in the underlying arc of the Cold War, but we're not going to really go into those proxy wars yet.
Yeah, I'll just say that, and we can get into this later with the domino effect, that the U.S., as Russia started influencing more of the world, of the communist world, that the U.S. felt that if they let one nation fail, then it would create a domino effect, and other countries would slowly either turn communist or would be invaded or from other nations.
Right, the countries surrounding said country that turned communist. So
That's what I was trying to say.
Right, like if China turned communist, which, spoiler alert, they do, even though they're the People's Republic of China. Just because you throw republic in your name doesn't mean you're a republic. Anyways, like if China fell to communism, then the surrounding areas also would fall to communism. And vice versa. It was the same thing that we thought for democracy. So if democracy was established in China, then all of the surrounding places would also be democracies.
Yeah, that's why Vietnam was such a big deal. So close to China, around all those other smaller Asian nations. Korea, South Korea, they were protecting South Korea from invasion. And then Cuba, so close to the U.S., had all that support from Russia. So that's why they became such a big deal, such flashpoints.
Right, which is why America suddenly took interest in like Turkey, because it was really close to Russia. And when it comes down to it, the U.S.S.R. gave nuclear weapons to Canada. I mean, not Canada, sorry. They gave nuclear weapons to Cuba.
Yeah.
And we gave nuclear weapons to Turkey. So it was one of those things where we were trying to establish probably nuclear hubs as close as we could get to that superpower.
And if you've seen X-Men First Class, we have them to thank for stopping World War III.
Thank you, mutants. We appreciate it. It was all Magneto.
Exactly.
Well, we had to have a common enemy, and the common enemy is evolution. Anyways, okay, so we're going to move on to the atomic age. Now, on August 6th of 1945, the world changed forever when the United States harnessed nuclear energy and dropped the world's first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion wiped out nearly 90% of the city and immediately killed 80,000 people. Tens of thousands more would later die of radiation exposure. Now, while the development and the use of the atomic bomb effectively ended World War II, it also propelled the world into an even more powerful nuclear weapons arena.
By 1949, U.S.S.R. had developed their own, and by 1952, Britain had also developed their own. So by the early 1950s, most major powers within the world were atomically capable. Or capable of developing atomic weapons, that is.
Right. And since my notes are a little more elaborate, I'm going to go into the atomic age. The atomic age began with the Manhattan Project and the advent of the atomic bomb, or the A-bomb as it's more commonly referred to. American ingenuity didn't stop there, because the notions of using a fission weapon led us to create what we call a super bomb, or a hydrogen bomb. Now, time for some science, and please forgive me and be gentle in your comments if I get some of this incorrect, because again, I'm a historian who's just going to lightly explain the difference between an atomic bomb and a hydrogen bomb. Because prior to doing the research for this podcast, I didn't realize there was a difference. I didn't know that there were two different types of nuclear energy bombs. Well, there's more than two different types, but the two types that we're going to talk about for the atomic age is going to be the atom bomb and the hydrogen bomb. Okay. So it's my understanding that an atomic bomb is created by having a larger element and proceeding to break that larger element down. Kind of think of it as the result of an explosion that's similar to somebody putting baking soda into a volcano model. You get a little bit of fizzing and a little bit of overflow. While the hydrogen bomb is a fission of elements that creates a reaction, and the result is much more like Mentos being dropped into a Coca-Cola, a sudden and powerful burst of fizz. That's kind of the difference between the two. Basically, the hydrogen bomb is thousands of times more powerful than the first atomic bombs that were created in the Manhattan Project. While the Americans were busy exploring new territories and nuclear power, Soviet directors believed that their focus should be on creating the atomic bomb and not on a hydrogen bomb. The Soviets were successful not only in creating an atomic bomb, but also in improving it. And on August 29th of 1949, the Soviets did their first nuclear test. And the first Soviet atomic bomb test puts pressure on the Americans to accelerate their work on their nuclear arsenal. And by 1952, the United States tested their first and the first fusion bomb. The explosion from this bomb yielded 10.4 megatons of energy. That's over 450 times the power of the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. The crater that was left in its wake was 6,240 feet wide and 164 feet deep. Now keep in mind, they did this test on an island in the Marshall Islands, which you World War II buffs, you'll know exactly where that is. But the island that they originally did this test on, the only thing that was left was that giant crater. The island was absolutely decimated. Shortly after this test, United States President Harry Truman announced the development of the hydrogen bomb to the world. And the United States once again looks to the next task, the building of a deliverable thermonuclear weapon. And deliverable means, at least my understanding of deliverable, means that you can weaponize it. Exactly.
Yeah, so going back to in between that time, that's basically 4 years, if not more, of the U.S. having an atomic bomb, and the Soviets do not. So imagine that fear, that paranoia that they have, that they're underpowered, and at any time the U.S. could drop a bomb on them as well.
Well, exactly. And to make sure that they weren't outdone, the Soviets they developed a thermonuclear weapon in 1953. Now, keep in mind that the Americans had just started research on it in 1952. So, less than a year later, the Soviets, who have now preceded the Americans, create a thermonuclear weapon. And this encourages the Soviets and actually gave them confidence in their future efforts in nuclear energy, and that it would yield that their technology and their research could really yield awe-inspiring results. Are you guys starting to see a pattern yet? The Americans and the Soviets are essentially driving each other to create, innovate, and test nuclear weaponry.
So we'll get into this more when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. But as far as the advent of the nuclear age, the nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction, the acronym MAD, is basically created by the U.S. that if there was a strike on them, that they would have the capability to also strike again, so that if Russia were to try and take out our country, then we would also have the capability to destroy them as well. So mutually assured destruction.
Think of it kind of like an arms race, because that's basically what it is. You know, you have, before every great war, you tend to have an arms race. There's like a big economic boom. You had it before World War I. You have it right before World War II. Well, not really an economic boom. I guess most of the world was in a depression before World War II. But you have an era of innovation for military weapons, often before warfare. And when World War II ends, the arms race that the superpowers get into is a nuclear arms race. It's who can develop more atomic bombs than the other person. And then it moves from who can develop more to who can develop better ones. And the atomic bomb turns into the hydrogen bomb, and then so forth and so on. So nuclear energy is harnessed into weaponry, and each side, the U.S.S.R. and the U.S., is trying to outdo each other. And in the process of outdoing each other, it creates a panic.
Yeah, just imagine by this point, the 50s and 60s, they've already developed these new capabilities, and they've also developed the quantity of weapons, plus adding in Britain and France and all these other countries, and they have hundreds and hundreds and thousands of these. So just imagine that capability when you saw what one did, what can hundreds of bombs do at once?
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you have any interest in nuclear energy or what the atomic bombs can do, you can actually get online and Google search what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you're talking, I read a statistic while I was doing research for this, and the people who died immediately were the lucky ones. Because if you were about 100 to 300 miles away from the atomic bomb, if you were looking at it, it blinded you because it literally melted your retinas. Most children under the age of 12 developed thyroid cancer within 10 years. And that was the ones who survived, by the way, because the vast majority of them died from radiation poisoning shortly after the atomic bombs. You have generations upon generations of mutilated people. Nuclear energy is one of those things where I actually can't believe that humanity decided, oh, well, the atomic bomb is just not enough. Let's create something more destructive called a hydrogen bomb. I was flabbergasted when doing research over this because I didn't realize that there was something more crazy than an atomic bomb. And like I said with my examples, an atomic bomb is the equivalent of you putting baking soda into your volcano science fair project versus a hydrogen bomb, which is dropping Mentos into a Coca-Cola. It's a big, big difference. Which brings us to the political conflict known as the Red Scare, or McCarthyism if, you're an American.
So this immediately preceded the end of World War II. But there's also a first Red Scare, you could say, right after World War One, because of some of the communist sympathizers within the U.S. after the Bolshevik Revolution.
Right, and socialism was really taking hold in the U.S. At that time.
Yeah, there was a lot of sympathy there for what was happening in Russia there in the late 19 teens, early 1920s. And so that kind of led to a lot of domestic terrorism against some of the political and economic elite. So imagine Rockefeller or Carnegie or those people basically being targeted because of their wealth or their influence on society into becoming such a capitalist country.
And that was the first Red Scare. This next Red Scare is going to grip America in a way that it didn't previously. It was really a time when federal employees were analyzed to determine, whether they had sufficient loyalty to the government. There's going to be committees over, un-American activities. Senator McCarthy is going to spearpoint this and investigate allegations against Hollywood, and the film industry is going to have a blacklist. It's just the scare and the hysteria that the Red Scare gives Americans is not to be underestimated.
Yeah, so that House Committee on Un-American Activities was actually started in the late 30s, because of the fear of communism at that time spreading into the country, the government, all reach of life. Only after World War II did it become that much greater target to try and find those communist sympathizers or even spies. What many people felt that there was so many sympathizers or spies even within the government that they had to do this to rid them of that problem.
Which leads me right into my next point, that this intense rivalry between the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. started raising concerns that there were communists and communist supporters or sympathizers inside America, and that they were actively working as spies. There's a lot of espionage in this time period. It's really like where James Bond comes
basically, the pre-James Bond, where there were basically people like that, real life people like that.
Real life 007s. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. Again, if you get inspired and you want to do some further research past this podcast, I definitely recommend you look at espionage in like the 50s and the 60s. It's pretty awesome. The type of gadgets that they came from. We laugh at some of the stuff that's in James Bond, but it's legit. Somebody made a gun out of an umbrella. It's in a museum. It's in like the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. It's great.
Anyways, back on topic. Joseph McCarthy is where McCarthyism comes from. He was a senator from Wisconsin. He basically took this opportunity to exploit the American fears for political gain. If that sounds crazy, because most politicians will do that nowadays. If you can just kind of see that everywhere.
Well, especially with the presidential elections
Yeah.
right now, it's
Just imagine it as the way that they talk about Muslims and Islamophobia, but even more
communism.
extreme with the nuclear age and that constant fear.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Oh man, tied in perfectly to current
Yeah.
events. Yeah. And you know what? Before you judge the past too harshly, because one of the things that is the job of a historian is to give you the facts and give you differing arguments and things like that. But keep in mind that while we look at it as hysteria, their ideas in this Red Scare wasn't totally unfounded. And they were correct that there were communist spies here in America. For example, in 1945, there was a physicist, and it didn't say what his nationality was, but he was currently working for the British mission at Los Alamos, which is the British Manhattan Project. And he has contact with an American industrial chemist. And this chemist was also a messenger for Soviet intelligence. He was a spy. And following that incident, almost a month later, barely a month later, all of a sudden, the Soviets have an atomic bomb program and they have detailed plans of the atomic bomb that the US had dropped on Japan. Their fears were not unfounded. The communist scare was something that was in actual presence here in America. We took it to the extreme. It's going to be very similar to the older listeners that we have. Right after 9/11, there was a lot of Muslim phobia, kind of like we have right now, actually. Islamophobia. I'm sorry. Islamophobia.
Islamophobia, not Lamophobia.
Anyways, okay. Islamophobia was a real thing after 9/11. And it was one of those things where, we had things like the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act restricted our freedoms in the greater scheme of, national security. It's going to be kind of the same thing. They're looking at communism as being like, well, we're going to take away some of your basic freedoms in lieu of the national, threat that we have currently going on with the U.S.S.R.
Yeah, and something interesting, something that I found interesting, as far as Hollywood goes in the 1950s, they were heavily targeted by this McCarthyism, these House Committee on Un-American Activities for these communist sympathies, and there was all these blacklists created. A lot of people were kind of thrown in there that didn't deserve to be. But what's interesting is that some of these movies that come out during this time, like The Blob or The Thing from Outer Space, or name any kind of alien invasion movie of the 50s, or even like Captain America, stuff like that, is kind of a direct correlation to fighting communism here. It just in general society within your community, not even the grander scheme of war.
What we currently live in, right now we live in something called the age of terrorism. And many of you, if you're younger listeners, have grown up in the age of terrorism. And you can kind of think of the age of terrorism and the way terrorism affects us today and influences both domestic and foreign policy for the United States was exactly the way communism did during this era, during the era directly after World War II. They're really related in a sense that what we experience today is what they were experiencing with communism 50 years ago. Shortly after President Truman finds out that Russia has atomic bomb plans, directly from the United States, he creates an executive order called the Loyalty Order, and it mandates that all federal employees be analyzed. And they're supposed to be analyzed to determine and ensure whether they're actually loyal to the United States government. Now, the U.S. is a country that prizes itself on the concepts of personal liberty and freedom of political organization. So this executive order was really a startling development at the time. But it was only one of many questionable activities that occurred during the anti-communism hysteria period that we know as the Red Scare. Hollywood studios are going to create blacklists barring suspected radicals from employment. Memberships to leftist groups dropped as it became clear that any association with those types of groups had some serious consequences. And many average Americans, and even those in Hollywood, are going to have their everyday lives disrupted if they were accused of being communist or a communist sympathizer. Lots of innocent people are going to be hounded by law enforcement, fired from their jobs, and their friends and their family are going to alienate them because they don't want to be associated with something as terrible as communism. And although the climate of fear and repression began to ease in the late 1950s, the Red Scare has continued to influence political debate in the decades since, and is often cited as an example of how unfounded fears can compromise civil liberties. It's, again, going back to, we use the Red Scare as an example of what not to do, and yet in 2001, we did exactly the same thing we did back then.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's going to conclude our podcast this go around. Just stay tuned for part 2. We should have that out in about a month or so. Give me a second to tell you what part 2 is going to be over.
Proxy wars and
stuff.
I can't remember.
I can't. Hold on, I've got to pull Twitter up. Not my Twitter. What is this? I don't know how to work it on here. Oh, God. I just do it on my phone. I don't know how to work it on the computer.
Desktop set.
Holy shit. Where's part 2? I got it.
You better find it.
I do, because I did not post it on Twitter like I thought I did.
That'll include the space race, the proxy war, some of which we talked about, the end of the Cold War, and then the effects thereafter that we still feel today.
Thanks for listening. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. And after we conclude the Cold War, we'll have, on our next podcast, a vote for you guys to tell us what we should research next. Follow us on Twitter.
And this is Logan.
And this is Nicole, and this is Scissors Beats Paper, a history podcast.